Let me begin today with, shoot, I've lost it. Oh, here it is.
Kushagra, please put up the slides. Just ask which slide.
Good. Good, thank you. Yesterday, you'll remember we talked about tort liability, the economics of tort liability and insurance. And we got to a discussion of autonomous vehicles. I was reminded in that discussion about this wonderful article by Steve Chevelle, a professor at the Harvard Law School. And I sent a copy to Professor Nagar, and I think she'll distribute it if you're interested in it. It's a long article. I think it's 40 pages or so, but it's a superb introduction to the issues of tort liability when there are autonomous vehicles are common on the road. Let me say one other thing about the world of autonomous vehicles. First of all, I wanted to mention this yesterday. We already have some autonomous vehicles. Airplanes, commercial airplanes are by and large autonomous vehicles. Pilots get them up into the air, but then from then on, it's autonomous until it's time to land when the pilots go to work again. So we've already had a world of autonomous vehicles, and it works pretty well. Secondly, I wanted to mention that many of the interesting legal issues about autonomous vehicles are going to arise during the transition from current driver controlled vehicles until we get to a world of almost unanimous or ubiquitous autonomous vehicles. When there's a combination of autonomous vehicles and driver mediated vehicles, there could be some significant issues. As I mentioned to you yesterday, the best estimates in the United States are that 94% of all automobile accidents are caused by driver error. That will diminish when there are autonomous vehicles mixed in with driver directed vehicles. But my goodness, we're going to have a real issue when there are accidents between a driver and an autonomous vehicle. Okay, that was those were some introductory words I wanted to make, and now I want to say just a couple of words about our topic today, the economic analysis of crime and punishment. There are two very significant differences about this area in contrast to what we've talked about before. And that is that the area of crime and punishment moves us away from the area of private law, where in property law, contract law, and tort law, the law is designed to help private parties who have disputes or might have disputes to get to figure out a way to get through their problems or avoid their problems. This is a different area. Crime is an area in which the disputes that arise are between an individual who is alleged to have committed a crime and all of us, the state, the collective. And this is called an area of public law, not an area of private law. So that's one significant difference. I'm not going to talk much about this, but as you well know, one of the significant differences is that a person who is alleged to have committed a crime is not facing another individual typically, but is facing the power of the state. And some procedural changes occur in criminal law that do not exist in civil law, so-called. But those are beyond our topic today. The other significant difference that exists with regard to criminal law is that this is an area in which empirical evidence is absolutely crucial. we're going to talk about some theories about why people commit crimes and therefore how we might deter them from committing crimes. But the significant issue the significant difference that I want to call your attention to now, and you'll see in the slide presentation, is that there is almost unavoidably an empirical content to criminal law that doesn't really exist. It could, but it doesn't really exist with regard to the private law subjects of property torts and contracts. Um, and we'll see that there has been a great deal of empirical studies of crime. We're always interested in whether the amount of crime is constant over time or is going up. That's always a reason for concern, or going down. And we've had experience in the United States, at least, with all of those things over the course of the last 30 years. We've had a period in the 1980s and before of quickly rising crime, and then in the 90s and until very recently, a period of declining crime. And in the last 2 years or so, a period of increasing crime. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about why that might happen, why that or how that can be deterred. And as you'll see, there are a lot of statistics and theories that have been proposed for why we have these variations in the amount of crime. It's I don't think anybody contends that there are variations in the amount of contracts being concluded successfully and those being breached. I don't think there's a pattern over time in that regard, nor perhaps with torts, but I'm not sure about that because we don't do a great deal of empirical work in that area. And we're not sure about variations over time with regard to property disputes. It'd be interesting to know those things, but we simply don't have evidence on that. Okay, here's a brief outline on slide 2 of where we're going to go here. We're going to talk about the central theme, the central economic and non-economic literature has focused on the theme of deterrence. How do we create incentives for people to not commit crimes? How do we create incentives for people to behave in a legal rather than an illegal way? We're going to discuss the so-called Becker theory of the decision to commit a crime, and we'll talk about the implications of that theory for criminal justice system policy. I want to flag this important distinction. Becker's work was theoretical. That means it was a proposed simplification of the complexities of the real world about how people decide to commit crimes and how we can deter them. But a theory, just because it's coherent, as the Becker theory certainly is, just because a theory is coherent does not mean it's correct. We have to confront the theory with data from the real world in order to see whether the theory survives that confrontation with the real world. And as we'll see, there's some evidence, strong evidence, that suggests that the Becker theory is a good theory of the decision to commit a crime and points us, therefore, in the direction of good policy to deter crime. We're going to look, fourthly, at empirical evidence regarding the rational choice theory of crime. And then I'm going to try to explain both the recent long decline in crime and then the sudden upturn in crime that has occurred in the last 2 or so years in the United States and in Western Europe. So let's go to the next slide, and I'll outline some of the assumptions that we're going to make for the time being. First of all, we're going to assume that people are rational decision makers. That's where almost all standard economic literature begins. As we'll see tomorrow, there may be some reasons for starting from a different presumption, namely that people are imperfectly rational. But for today, let's continue to assume that people are rational decision makers. And I want to draw your attention to the fact that there are other theories in the social sciences beside the Becker theory of crime. One hypothesis that is very common among non-economists is that crime is the result of socioeconomic factors. In particular, crime by people who don't have much in the way of income or prospects for getting income and are desperate are people who may be the ones who commit a lot of crime. That may not be true, as we'll see, but there are other crimes of fraud and the like, where people do not seem to be motivated by socioeconomic factors. But this first hypothesis has been the central hypothesis in the social sciences for decades, and is fighting for supremacy with the Becker theory. The second general hypothesis, the economic hypothesis, suggests that people respond to incentives. Crime occurs because criminals believe that the benefits exceed the costs, and they can be deterred by raising the costs of committing a crime. That's a very simple outline of the difference between two important social science approaches to crime. We're going to focus, obviously, on hypothesis 2. Okay, next slide. The person who articulated this first in the economic literature was a brilliant economist named Gary Becker, who's now deceased. Gary Becker won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1992, the year before Ronald Coase, his colleague at the University of Chicago, won the Nobel Prize in Economics. And Becker's scholarship, all of it's interesting and good. But this literature that I'm going to tell you stems from one article. It's called Crime and Punishment, an Economic Approach. And it appeared in the 76th volume of the Journal of Political Economy, beginning at page 167 in 1968. It's an astonishingly good article. And it's one of those articles that had a profound effect not only on the profession of economics, but on economic policy directed at crime for 20 or 30 years after the article appeared. The gist of the crime is extremely easy to articulate. Becker considers the decision to commit a crime to be a rational choice that people make. They compare the costs of committing a crime with the benefits of committing a crime, and they will commit the crime or might commit the crime if the benefits exceed the costs. The implication is that we can deter crime by raising the anticipated or expected costs of crime, or by somehow lowering the benefits of committing a crime. On the next slide, I put in very simple terms exactly what this means for the decision to commit a crime. And I want to notice to you that there are several elements of the expected costs of a crime. The first is the probability of detection, arrest, and conviction. Again, I made this point yesterday, I want to make it again. We're assuming rational decision makers who can make some sort of estimate or do make some sort of estimate of the probability of detection, arrest, and conviction. The second element of the expected costs of crime, back to the previous slide, please. The second element of the expected costs of crime are the value of the criminal sanction. Is that sanction in money? Is it a fine? Or is it in lost enjoyment of freedom. You're going to be imprisoned for a felony for more than a year. That's the dividing line between a misdemeanor and a felony. In English parlance, if you commit a misdemeanor, you only go to jail for less than a year. But if you commit a felony, a more serious crime, you go to prison for a year or longer. So in computing or estimating the expected cost of a crime, a potential criminal will compute the probability of detection, arrest, and conviction times the value of the sanction in order to decide whether or not to commit the crime. And of course, being a rational decision maker, the potential criminal is going to compare that expected value or expected benefit of committing a crime with the opportunity cost of the crime. What else could he or she be doing with their time to generate happiness or utility? And that has to be worked into the estimate of the value of the sanction as well. Next slide. In talking about how to increase the anticipated expected costs of crime, Becker told us that it is generally cheaper to increase the expected cost of crime by raising the sanction rather than by incurring the real resource costs of raising the probabilities of detection, arrest, and conviction. This is an important point. If you want to deter crime, you raise the expected costs of crime. And Becker suggests that there are two principal ways to do that, or a combination of ways. First, increase the expected probability of detection, arrest, or conviction. Secondly, increase the sanction, the fine, or the term of imprisonment for committing a crime. And his argument was that increasing the probabilities of detection, arrest, and conviction cost real resources. You have to install more cameras. You have to have more police to do investigations. You have to have more judges and courtrooms in order to hold the criminal trials if you're going to increase the probability of detection, arrest, and conviction. In fact, let me say this by way of footnote. We have increased the probabilities of detection through things like forensic computer investigations or forensic examination of cell phone records. Nowadays, for example, the police use cell phone records of an alleged criminal to find out where they have been. Because our phones can be used to tell us where we have been. They've got what are called geolocation devices in them. The police use our cell phones to see if they can get evidence about where we have been. And if there was a crime committed in point A, and it turns out we were at point A at the time the crime was committed, and that can be determined by looking at our cell phones, that's very valuable information that increases the probability of detection. I heard of an episode like this just yesterday that was fascinating to me. In our town, the daughter of a man, a father and a daughter were having an argument in their household, and the father shot the daughter and killed her. And he told the police that she had attacked him with a hammer. She had hit him in the head with a hammer, and that he feared for his life. And so in self-defense, he shot her. It's a plausible story. He was not arrested, but the police did take his cell phone. And what they discovered was that the recording device on his phone had been operating during the time that he was having an argument with his daughter, and the recording indicated that he had hit her with the hammer, and she was obviously very seriously injured. And said she was going to go to the phone and call the police to come and get him. And that's when he said, "I'm going to shoot you." And he picked up his gun and shot her to prevent her from calling the police. Who would have thought that a recording on a cell phone could increase the probability of detection of a crime? And as you know, I don't know if this is true in India, but it's certainly true in the United States. There are cameras everywhere. Many people now have cameras on their front door to see who's coming to their house or their apartment. And whenever there's a crime in a particular area, the police go from house to house asking if they can look at the records from the private cameras on the front doors of people in the area. So there are ways that the probabilities of detection, arrest, and conviction can be increased, and thereby perhaps increase the expected cost of crime and therefore deter crime. But Becker's point was still a very, very important one. Sometimes it's costly to increase the probability of detection, arrest, and conviction, and it's just a lot easier to just say, okay, we're going to increase the imprisonment from 2 years to 5 years, and hope that that news gets to potential criminals and serves as a deterrent. Next slide, please. This theory is so powerful and has such important implications for policy that there's a strong urge on the part of both social scientists and policymakers to find out whether the empirical work about crime supports the Becker's theory. Oh, there's one other thing I wanted to tell you. It's a kind of interesting story. Where did Becker get the idea for this marvelous article? Well, he, you know, we tend to think of geniuses sitting in their chair and quietly thinking and coming up with a theory, which of course they do. But Becker told this story about how he came up with the idea of a rational choice theory of the decision to commit a crime. He said that he had a committee meeting at the University of Chicago that began at 3 o'clock. I'm making that part up. And he drove from his home to the place where the meeting was to take place. There were no parking spaces available. He drove around the block, hoping to find a parking space. He didn't find one, and he did it again, didn't find a parking space. And by now he's going to be late for the meeting at 3 o'clock. And he saw a spot where it said no parking allowed, and a fine was on the sign saying no parking allowed. And he thought to himself, if I park here and I get a ticket for illegal parking, and there's only a probability that I'll get a ticket, I might not get a ticket at all. But if there's a 50% chance of getting a ticket, he said, is the benefit of my going to this committee meeting high enough that it's worth it to incur the probability of this sanction for parking illegally? And he decided it was. So he parked illegally, went to the meeting. The story doesn't tell us whether he got a ticket or not, but he claimed that that's when he started thinking about a rational choice theory of committing a crime. Slide number 8, please. The academic literature, including the empirical literature on the decision to commit a crime, not only was important to economists, it was extremely important in the real world of policy making, particularly criminal justice system policy making. In the United States in the early 1980s, the Congress created something called the United States Sentencing Commission, which was a group of very powerful politicians and academics that included the future Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer, who at the time was a professor of law at Harvard Law School and had written some fascinating work about criminal justice. The U.S. Sentencing Commission had been established to consider the implications of the Becker theory for sentencing people for breaking federal, that is national, federal criminal statutes. And the Becker theory led to a general decline in discretionary sentencing. Judges, prior to the mid-1980s, judges in the United States, when presented with a criminal complaint and a conviction, had a wide range of sanctions that they could impose, 2 to 5 years, 5 to 10 years, and the like. And it was up to the judge to decide where in that range it was appropriate to assign any particular criminal defendant. And where the judge assigned the particular sentence depended on the judge's evaluation of all the relevant factors. The U.S. Sentencing Commission recommended a very great narrowing of the limits of the sentence that a judge could impose. Why? Because the theory was that a criminal, in deciding whether or not to commit a crime, thinks about the sanction. And if the sanction is a broad range, let me say 5 to 10 years, the criminal doesn't know what it's appropriate to put into his calculation of the sanction in his calculation of the expected cost. And so they thought that it was better to reduce the discretion of judges. We've now started to reverse that because that apparently didn't work very well. And a third example is the remarkable increase in the sentencing of criminals to prison. Between 1980 and 2012, there was a 400%, a fourfold increase in the prison population in the United States, both at the state and at the federal level. There were 500,000 prisoners in jails in the United States in 1980. By 2012, there were 2.4 million prisoners. We had by far the highest rate of imprisonment of any country in the world. And the reason for that was that the Becker theory was guiding criminal justice system policy. Sentencing people to prison was going to be a big deterrent. And we've measured whether it was the deterrent, and I'm going to talk about that literature shortly, and that's fascinating. Next slide, please. This is data about U.S. Statistics on crime for the 1990s. We've experienced since at least 1991, and perhaps a little bit earlier, but most studies focus on the period after 1991. We've had a tremendous decline in both nonviolent and violent crime. The U.S. today has less auto theft than almost all of Western Europe. And one of the things, that's a very recent development. It has been thought that every crime, nonviolent or violent, was much higher in the United States than in Western Europe. Not true. Much less property crime in the United States than is generally the case in Western Europe. The property crimes fell 30% of the 1990s, and then fell another 30% in the first decade and a half, that is to 2015 at least, in the United States. And there's been a tremendous decline in the amount of violent crime. Violent crime is always difficult for people to estimate trends, because violent crime is frequently in the news. As I was mentioning to you, our local paper had this story about the father who shot his daughter yesterday, and that's news. but we don't really get statistics in the local paper, but the statistics indicate, the data indicate that there's been a huge decline in violent crime since 1991, or perhaps a little bit before. Homicide rates declined throughout the 1990s, throughout the first decade of the 21st century, and continued to decline until about 2020. In the last couple of years, there's been a slight increase in violent crime in the last 2 years, and we'll try to explain why shortly. But that's the pattern that we have seen. The interesting, next slide, please. The interesting fact that the data reveal about the decline in crime, the great decline in crime since 1990 or 91, is that it's occurred everywhere in the United States, not just in a few places, not just in large cities. It's occurred in rural areas as well. The greater drops were in metropolitan areas and in cities with populations of greater than 250,000. But decline happened everywhere, including smaller towns like the one I live in that has a population of about 100,000. Next slide, please. I wanted to say something about the comparative rates of decline in crime in the United States and in Western Europe. Homicide rates did decline in the European Union in the 1990s, but not nearly as much as they declined in the United States. And the same thing is true of other violent and non-violent crimes. The decline in the United States was much greater than it was in Western Europe. Next slide, please. And of course, that raises the issue of why. Why did this decline of almost 30 years, why did this decline occur? And there are several theories. One is that deterrence works. And that means that the Becker model worked. We significantly increased incarceration rates, and incarceration rates are the rate at which we assign people who've committed crimes to prisons. And as I mentioned to you, between 1980 and 2012, the number of prisoners in the United States increased by a factor of 4. The theory that many people subscribe to is that increase in imprisonment took a lot of criminals off the streets, and the rest of us had the benefit of having very little crime. Also, within this headline of deterrence works, it's true that the police, the numbers of police until very recently increased, and there was improved policing strategies that I'll talk about in a minute too. And as I've already mentioned, there were technological improvements, DNA as a factor for increasing identifying a potential criminal has been a significant change. Cameras everywhere has been a significant change. A second general theory was that there's been a decline in the market in addictive drugs. The focus is usually on what's called crack cocaine, but it's also true of heroin and other drugs. There has been a decline in the use of significant drugs. But interestingly enough, there's been a tremendous increase in deaths from the use of some drugs and like heroin and some illegal drugs. For example, opioids, which are drugs, legal drugs for dealing with pain, now account for, in recent years, as many as 90,000 deaths a year in the United States. The illegal use of a legal drug, an opioid, accounts for 90,000 deaths a year. Just so you have a comparison, there are about 45,000 deaths every year from automobile accidents, and there are about 15,000 homicides that take place in the United States. So the deaths from opioid addiction are much, much higher. But there's a decline in the sort of illegal drugs like crack cocaine, and that could be a factor. It is sometimes alleged that crime moves inversely with the economy. So when the economy goes up, the opportunity cost of crime goes up because there are more jobs and more lucrative jobs. So crime should go down when the economy does better. When the economy goes into a recession, the opportunity cost of crime falls, and as a result, incomes fall, and people may find crime more attractive. So it's alleged that one of the factors that could have explained the decline in violent and nonviolent crime between 1991 and 2019 was the relative strength of the economy. A fourth possibility is increased victim precaution. The victims of crime may be protected in better ways today that deter crime. For example, alarms, more lighting at nighttime, faster and more effective traumatic treatment by physicians and EMTs, emergency medical treatment teams. And a fifth factor that I'm going to come back to that may explain the decline in crime is the legalization of abortion. I put a question mark after that factor because you might think, what could that possibly have to do with the level of crime? Abortion was legalized throughout the United States in January 1973 by a decision of the United States Supreme Court that's called Roe v. Wade, that made abortion legal up to the end of the second trimester of pregnancy. And we'll see that there's a strong empirical argument to suggest that that was a significant factor in the decline in crime. As you know, things are going the other way in the United States now. The Supreme Court has voided Roe v. Wade, and the issue of abortion rights has gone back to the states, and many states have made abortion essentially illegal. Other states like Illinois, which proudly makes abortion available, are having an increase, a tremendous increase in the number of people who are coming into our states simply to get an abortion. And so I hate to say this because I don't like thinking this, but this decision to void Roe v. Wade is going to serve as a fascinating experiment to see if the illegalization of abortion is going to be followed by an increase in crime. It won't be followed by an increase in crime immediately, but it might in the next 15 to 20 years cause an increase in crime. And I'll explain why when we talk about that literature. The next slide, please. We know that these 6 factors probably played almost no role in the decline in crime from the 1990s. We know that the strong economy of the 1990s probably didn't have any effect on crime. And part of the reason we know that is that during the 1990s, we had one of the longest continuous runs of increases in the economy we've ever had. And the amount of crime did go down, that's true. But we've also had a severe recession called the Great Recession that took place in 2008. And that should have caused an increase in crime. It did not. So we strongly suspect that whatever connection may have existed between the increase and decrease in the economy and the amount of crime probably is not working. The changing demographics of the society probably didn't have a very large effect. We've had an increase in the number of older people, and older people do not commit crimes by and large. And that should lead to a decrease in crime, but apparently there's no connection. Better policing strategies probably didn't have much of effect. Gun control laws, which are largely ineffective. Cook County, the county in which Chicago sits, forbids the private ownership of guns entirely. And yet there's lots of gun violence in Chicago. Gun control laws probably don't work. So-called concealed carry laws. There's a famous literature that began with the work of David Mustard and John Lott that purported to show a relationship between a state's adopting a concealed carry law, which allows people to have a gun and to carry it, but only if it's hidden from view. Lott and Mustard contended that those laws might deter crime because a criminal never knew whether the person he was or she was about to try to steal things from might have a gun. And a rational criminal would not prefer to go against a person who has a gun. Finally, another factor that probably played no role is the increased use of capital punishment. This is part of the Becker theory. I'm not going to talk much about this when we get to this, but capital punishment, killing people, the state killing people, increased tremendously in the 1990s and in the early 2000s. And the fact that the number of people we executed went up at the same time that crime went down is probably not a causal relationship. It's probably just coincidence. And I'll try to explain something about that a little bit later. Gary Becker's most famous student was a very distinguished professor of economics named Isaac Ehrlich, who teaches at the State University of New York in Buffalo. I have a sister who lives in Buffalo, so when I go to Buffalo, I frequently talk with him. Isaac Ehrlich did a doctoral dissertation that applied Becker's hypothesis about criminal behavior to the deterrence effect of capital punishment. His hypothesis, which makes a great deal of common sense, was that if the sanction for committing very serious crimes is capital punishment, that ought to deter people from committing crimes. And he did some very careful, very good empirical work about the relationship in states at the state level between capital punishment and crimes that happened after capital punishment. And he found famously, it's a very famous finding, that one additional execution causes a decline of 7 subsequent serious crimes. So he did measure that, and he found a very significant deterrent effect of capital punishment. Please skip ahead now to, where am I? The slides that I'm skipping over, I want to urge you to look at when you have time, but please skip to slide number 26. This slide is a famous slide from the work of John Donahue and Justin Wolfers. John Donahue is one of my favorite law and economics people. He teaches at Stanford. He has a PhD in economics and a law degree. And Justin Wolfers is a very distinguished economist who now teaches at the University of Michigan. They did a very careful study of the relationship between executions, that is, the use of capital punishment, and crime levels, homicide levels, to see if there was a discernible relationship. And this graph comes from their a Stanford Law Review article on this topic. I'll try to tell you a story that John told me about this article after we look at this graph. This is a complicated graph to look at, but it's like every good graph. If you pay careful attention to the graph, it's going to teach you a lot. So let me try to tell you what's in this graph. There are three important axes for you to measure or to pay attention to. The axis on your left that says 0, 3, 6, 9, 12, that measures the homicides per 100,000 residents or population. Number of homicides per 100,000 population. So if we're measuring that along the left axis, if the line goes up, that indicates that there's been an increase in the number of homicides per 100,000 people. The other two axes are along the bottom axis is the dates, 1950 through the 2001. That's when the article was published in roughly 2005. So that's when their data ended. And the important things to measure on that axis, the time axis, are indicated by the arrows, the big arrows at the bottom of the graph. The first set of arrows, there are three of them, regard the United States. And the first arrow on your left as you're looking at this says the death penalty in US. That means that between 1950 and 1971, the death penalty was available in the United States in the vast majority of states and at the federal level as well. But then between 1971 and about 1976, the death penalty was abolished. The United States Supreme Court, in a very famous case in 1971, said the death penalty is not being applied appropriately, and you need to rethink how you do this because you're violating the Constitution in the way you assign people to the death penalty. In 1976, the states had made adjustments, and so from 1976 on, the death penalty was legal. So the third arrow at the bottom of the graph, the upper level of arrows, says that in 1976 the death penalty in US is reestablished. The two arrows below those arrows describing the United States regard the death penalty in Canada. And from 1950 to roughly 1966, the death penalty was available in Canada, roughly for the same crimes that it was available for in the United States and most of Western Europe. But then beginning in 1966, Canada slowly got away from the death penalty. They abolished it in almost all circumstances, but not all. For example, if you killed a police officer, you were subject to the death penalty in Canada. So those two lines of arrows denote different time periods in the United States and in Canada. And they give rise to those three vertical lines in the middle of the graph that indicate the first line on your left, the first vertical line indicates the date at which the death penalty was abolished in Canada, except for a few crimes. The second vertical line indicates when the United States Supreme Court found the death penalty to be unconstitutional. Third vertical line is when the United States Supreme Court reinstated the legality, the constitutionality of the Supreme Court or of the death penalty. So finally, the graph on the right, on your right hand side, goes 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and that measures the number of executions that were taking place in both Canada and the United States per 100,000 residents. Okay, that's a lot of explanation to now try to turn your attention to the two lines. There are two lines that move across time that indicate the number of homicides that were occurring. In the dotted line, we see the number of homicides that were occurring in every year between 1950 and 2001. In the solid line, the lower line, we see the number of homicides that were occurring in Canada at the same time between 1950 and 2001. You don't need to read this carefully to see what this graph illustrates is an extraordinarily important factor, and it is, forgive me, what's being illustrated in this graph is that homicide rates in the United States and in Canada appear to be moving at exactly the same direction at every point in time. They beginning in the late 1950s, early 1960s, they start to go up together. They may diverge a little bit, but then they start to go down together. And the point that Donahue and Wolfers make is that whatever's explaining homicide rates in the United States and in Canada, it's not the difference in the availability of the death penalty. It's extraordinary. It's a wonderful graph because it illustrates with a picture, and this is the great value of a picture, it illustrates that the homicide rates in the United States and Canada are moving in the same general pattern, but that pattern has nothing to do with whether the death penalty is available or unavailable. You can make mistakes in looking at a graph, but that seems to be the message that's coming through very loud and clear. The next factor that I want to, next slide, please, that I want to conclude my remarks on are to talk about four factors that may help to explain the decline in crime. One is increases in the number of police. We know that there's a very strong relationship between the number of police who are available in a jurisdiction and the amount of crime. And it's a very strong inverse relationship. The larger the number of police, the fewer the crimes. This is an interesting point to make. Almost every police force in the United States today is looking for more police to join the police force. We're not sure why, except that between when the pandemic struck, a lot of people resigned from their jobs. And one of the professions that took the largest hit during the pandemic was the police profession. It's possible that the increase in crime that's resulted in 2020 and 2021 is that slight upturn in crime is because there are fewer police around. Secondly, the rising prison population between 1980 and 2012 may help to explain the decline in crime. We're not sure about that. We also should say that the reason I'm terminating that rising population of criminals in 2012 is that from 2012 to the present, we've tried to find ways not to sentence people to prison, and the number of prisoners has declined significantly in every state and in the federal system as well. The receding crack epidemic. Crack cocaine was a product innovation that you should know about. Cocaine as a powder is very expensive, but crack cocaine is a method of producing cocaine that makes it much cheaper and therefore much more affordable to a wider section of the population. But the crack cocaine epidemic began to decline in the 1990s and has declined significantly in the 21st century. And the legalization of abortion. So that I want to conclude by talking about the legalization of abortion and the decline in crime. So please turn to slide 33. This the next couple of slides, and there are only, I think, 4 left. This crime describes an extremely famous article published by John Donahue, the lawyer and economist at Stanford, whom I mentioned to you, and Steve Levitt, the very famous author of Freakonomics and an incredibly productive and thoughtful economist at the University of Chicago. This article appeared in 2003. It was entitled "The Impact of Legalized Abortion on Crime." And it appeared in a very high quality economic journal. And let me tell you this background story that I've heard from both authors about how they did this. Both of these scholars have been working on the causes of crime and other aspects of the legal and economic aspects of crime for decades. And I think they, like many other scholars, were puzzled by the decline in crime that began in the early 1990s. And John and Steve met at a conference and were talking, as when people go to conferences, they talk to each other, and it's always a source of a valuable exchange. They were talking to each other at a conference, and they were talking about the decline in crime in the 1990s. And one of them said, I found a relationship between the number of abortions performed in a state and a later decline in crime. And the other one said, I did too. And then they both agreed that they had put those results in a desk drawer and forgot about them because they couldn't think of any connection that could possibly exist between the level or number of abortions taking place in a jurisdiction and a later decline in crime. But then they thought, well, maybe there's something here. So they started working on this and came up with this incredible article. They say that half of the crime decline after 1991 is attributable to the legalization of abortion in the famous Roe v. Wade case in 1973. Here's the connection. I'll tell you more, but here's the central connection. Roe v. Wade, the opinion was handed down in January 1973, led to a significant increase in the number of abortions. The abortions that existed before 1973, by the way, were almost illegal everywhere, except for 4 states that had legalized abortion. But between 1973 and 1980, there were approximately 1.6 million abortions per year. Now, there were illegal abortions before 1973, but they were not nearly at that level. They may have been in the low thousands. We don't know. But the increase between 1973 and 1980 was immense, 1.6 million. 1 abortion for every 2 live births. That's an amazing coincidence. And the important point about that is that beginning in 1991, there were many fewer 18-year-old males in the population. Abortion led to there being many fewer 18-year-old males beginning in 1991. Now, why should that cause a connection to the decline in crime? I'll tell you what they say in just a minute. But they strongly believe that this factor explains half of the decline, and everything else that I've talked about, the decline of crack cocaine, the increase in the prison population, all of those things together account for the other half of crime. Next slide, please. What's the connection between the legalization of abortion and crime? We know this in almost every society. The vast majority, more than half, well more than half of the crime is committed by 18 to 24-year-old males. It's a difficult time of life for males. They are taking risks. They are leaving their home. They are coming into contact with a peer group, and it's a difficult time. And one of the reasons that's often given for imprisoning young male offenders is that they'll grow up. So by the time they're 24, they will have grown up, their brains will have fully matured, and they'll be launched onto the regular course of life of getting an education, getting a job, getting a partner for life, having a family, and settling down. So one of the arguments for imprisonment is it takes people out of this group that commits a large amount of crimes. And because of abortion, there are fewer people in that cohort of 18 to 24-year-old males for a long time after 1991 because of the large number of abortions. We know that I said four, but it's 5 states had legalized abortion in 1970 before Roe v. Wade. And if there's a connection between legalized abortion and the amount of crime, it follows that in the 5 states that had legalized abortion before the Roe decision in 1973, the crime decline should have occurred earlier in those 5 states than it did in the other 45 states. And that's exactly what they found. Next slide, please. Donahue and Levitt suggest that the higher rates of abortion in a state in the late 1970s and early 1980s are very strongly linked to lower crime in that state for the period 1985 to 1997. There's no relationship between abortion rates. This is the 4th point they make. There's no relationship between abortion rates in the mid-1970s and crime changes between 1972 and 1985. Almost all of the decline in the 1990s can be attributed to a reduction in crime among the cohort of males in particular born after the legalization of abortion in 1973. And there is no change in the amount of crime among older cohorts in the 30 years before their article was published. Older people were not committing crimes because older people tend not to commit crimes. And there were many fewer 18-year-olds beginning in 1991. So the crime rate declined dramatically. One last slide, and then we'll stop, and I'll be happy to take your questions. There are 2 effects that Donahue and Levitt point to. I'm sorry. Please go to slide 37. There are 2 particular causes that Donahue and Levitt draw attention to: the cohort size effect and the cohort quality effect. A cohort, of course, is a group in a population, usually born at the same time or not born at the same time. They distinguish between excuse me, between a cohort size effect and a cohort quality effect. The cohort size effect I've already pointed to. The number of people coming into the most likely time in their lives to commit crime was much smaller beginning in 1991 and continuing thereafter because of the great increase in the number of abortions. The cohort size of crime prone teenagers in early 20s declined significantly. And they estimate that caused half of the decline in the 50%. So this explains 25% of the decline in crime. But the cohort quality effect is a different and distinguishable, excuse me, a distinguishable effect. And it says that the children who were born after 1973 were better children and less likely to commit crime. Why is that? What are they talking about? The implication is that the fetuses that were aborted after 1973 included a group of people who would probably have committed crimes. But those who were born after 1973's legalization of abortion were less likely to commit crime. Why is that? And the argument is fairly straightforward and simple. It is that women use the availability of abortion. Excuse me, let me try to get rid of this. Women use the availability of abortion to have a child when it's most easy for them to have an abortion or have a child. If you're a single mother, you don't have a job, there's nobody in your family nearby to help you take care of the child, that's not a good time to have a child. Excuse me, you're going to have to try to find somebody to help take care of the kids. You hope you can get a job to have income to help support the child. You wish that there were grandparents nearby who would take care of the children for you. But with the availability of abortion, you can postpone having a child until conditions are better, until you have a job or you have insurance or you have a partner or a mate, a husband or a wife, and there is somebody available to help take care of the children. That's that's what we understand to be the case with the decision to have an abortion. People used it largely to postpone having children until the time was better. Donahue and Levitt have some evidence to suggest that these decisions about aborting when it was legal to have abortion meant that women had children in times that were better for them, and they could care for the children more carefully so that those children did not grow up unsupervised or with little income or anything of the sort that might contribute to crime. And they attribute 25% of the decline in crime after the 1991 point as being attributable to this cohort quality effect. I have talked to groups of people, judges, lawyers, private citizens, about this research, and this cohort quality effect is the one that makes them most angry. And I think I understand why. It's difficult to distinguish the kind or the quality of children in this bold way. And they have to have some pretty strong evidence for this. They've got some evidence, but it's not quite as strong as the evidence for the cohort size effect. At any rate, let me say just a word in closing about the uptick in crime that happened in 2020 and 2021. Crime has increased almost everywhere in the United States, not just in a few places, but everywhere, including this town, since the pandemic began in 2020. Just to tell you a personal factor, we have a front porch where in the evenings, I often sit out there if the weather is nice and read. And we're 5 or 6 blocks from the downtown of Champaign. And during the summer, almost every night, I hear gunfire in downtown Champaign. That never happened before. And the number of deaths and shootings of people that injure them but don't kill them has gone way up in almost every city, and as has the amount of crime. We think that's due to the disruption of society from the pandemic, and also the small number of police who exist. And there are new kinds of crime that are happening. There's a lot of computer crime today in which people defraud people of their money by sending them emails that look as if they come from the federal government, and they say you owe back taxes and you should pay me $1,000 or pay the IRS $1,000 to wipe out this debt. It's not from the government, but many people have fallen for that fraud. The other kind of crime that's new but has increased recently is what's called mob crime, MOB crime. This happens when a group of people decide to go into a store and steal a lot of things at the same time and then rush out of the store with their stolen merchandise. There are too many of them to be stopped by the employees. This is happening even in small towns like ours. Anyway, I hope that's excited some questions. I'll check the chat stream here to see if it has, but please feel free to ask questions. The first one I see here is laws can be efficient, but what about justice? That's a great question, and I should have said something about that. One of the benefits I had of being around a lot of law faculty who didn't know economics was that they weren't in the business of teaching law in order to make this society more efficient. They were there to try to make this society more just. I sympathize with that. I understand that, and I'm very sensitive to that. I like efficiency. I think efficiency is a worthwhile goal, but I think that justice is clearly a more important goal. I think there's also a connection between efficiency and justice. I think that it's a complicated relationship. It's not straightforward. It's not always the case that a more efficient law is also a more just law. We can get societies perhaps to work more efficiently by doing things that are unjust, like removing the writ of habeas corpus. That famous writ from English law requires the state, if they arrest somebody, to explain why they did that. And that's a law premise not so much on efficiency as it is on justice, to make sure that the state is performing in a legitimate and just way. So that's a good question, and I agree with you that the justice is extremely important. Here's another question, I think. Is the idea of deterrence still considered reliable in contemporary times? For example, recent research has shown that there is no link between either the presence or absence of the death penalty and murder rates. I agree with that. That's a good point. I think that the strong connection between deterrence and the decision to commit a crime that is the premise of the Becker hypothesis, I don't think that's as widely believed today as it was in the 1970s and 1980s. I think there's a thought that we have to try to deter crime, but that there are many other factors in a society, like the legalization of abortion. Who thought that might be relevant? But the legalization of abortion and other factors like technology and the aging of the population may be significant factors in the decisions about whether to commit a crime. I think that the deterrent effect of the death penalty is almost zero, almost. But there's a strong movement in the United States, I hope elsewhere as well, to minimize the use of the death penalty. A graph that I didn't talk about, but that is contained in the slide presentation. It's not a good graph because I don't have the axes labeled, but nonetheless, you'll get the sense if you look at that the number of executions has gone down significantly. And even when we were killing people at the rate of 400 to 500 people a year, which was the case in the 1980s and 1990s. Those, well more than half of those executions occurred in just 4 states. And it wasn't a broad societal commitment to the death penalty. If you want to read a really moving book about this, Scott Turow, Turow, is a lawyer who is also a very distinguished and very prolific writer of fiction about the law, was on a commission appointed by the governor of Illinois to examine the death penalty. We don't have the death penalty in the state of Illinois anymore because that committee that Scott Turow and others served on recommended to the governor that he get rid of the death penalty. And Scott Turow wrote a short book called The Ultimate Punishment. It's 100 pages or less about his experience of examining the death penalty. And I'm happy to say, I'm proud of this fact that the United States is relying much less on the death penalty than it has. I think many people would subscribe to the view that maybe we shouldn't abolish the death penalty. Maybe we should save it for the very worst kind of criminal. But I think the prevailing trend in the United States is to get rid of the death penalty, and we don't really believe that it deters serious crime. Can we include? It's another question. Can we include increased ownership of guns by civilians as a matter of victim precaution? That was the principal connection that people found. But I don't think that that's true anymore. There are a lot of stories that suggest that simply by what's called brandishing, that just means taking a gun out and showing that you've got a gun, that fact is enough to deter a criminal. But I think on the other side of the consideration here is the fact that having 2 people shoot at each other in a public place, and that's happened, by the way, very close to our house, having people shooting at each other can have, as economists would say, a very high external cost. If people know that there are guns everywhere, they may be less inclined to go out shopping or leave their homes and have things delivered to their homes instead. I'm a skeptic about the ability of guns held by civilians to reduce crime. It may. I don't know the latest empirical evidence on that. Can increasing psychological well-being and social support play a significant role in crime? Another great question. I hope so. And I think we need to do some evaluation of that fact. To my knowledge, there are very few studies that look at the connection between better feelings about oneself, more optimism, more happiness, and social support and crime. I would predict, as I think you would, Ms. Kapoor or Mr. Kapoor, I think you would anticipate that an increase in psychological well-being and social support would lead to a decline in crime. That's my suspicion too, but I'm not aware of any empirical evidence that supports that. I should say to you that I was very deeply affected by my relationship with psychologists in the course of the 1990s and the early 2000s. My best friend, one of my best friends here on the faculty was the psychologist whose name was Ed Diener, D-I-E-N-E-R, who was one of the fathers in psychological literature of measuring happiness. And I had him come to the law school and give talks. I think it was one of the most popular talks that we've ever had at the law school. Unfortunately, Ed died about a year and a half ago. But he was a firm believer that you could measure happiness levels in different societies, and that there was a very strong connection between increases in happiness and a decline of bad things like suicide crime and the like. Here's one of the last questions. Can we attribute the recent rise in crime to the reduction in the economy? Probably not. I'm not certain of that, but I don't think so. And the reason I say that is that we thought there was a connection, an inverse relationship, rising economy, decreasing crime, decreasing economy, rising crime. That was the hypothesis, one of the hypotheses that was sort of undone by the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, the most serious recession we've had since the Great Depression of the 1930s. And there was not an increase in crime during that period. I'm guessing at this because I'm not sure, but I think the most plausible explanation for the recent increase in the amount of crime was the isolation that we all suffered during the pandemic. I think it's caused a lot of anxiety and changes in society. Why some people react to that anxiety or the stress of the pandemic by committing more crimes, I do not know. But if there is a connection between the decline in psychological well-being and crime going up, I think the period 2020, 2022 illustrates that. Why has abortion been made illegal? That's a good question, Renita. Let me be careful about the decision that the Supreme Court handed down last June. It did not make abortion illegal. What it did was say that there's no federal right to abortion. That's what the Roe v. Wade made abortion constitutionally protected, which means that there was a uniform law across all of the states in the union that said you had to allow abortion up till the end of the second trimester. That decision, I like it. I have two sisters and a dear wife, and they tell me how angry they are about the change that the Supreme Court did. The Supreme Court, in essence, said there's no federal right to abortion, but if the states want to do this, that's their business. Approximately half of the states have announced that they are going to make abortion very difficult or illegal. And some of them are trying to make it a crime for somebody to leave their state to have an abortion somewhere else. So we're going to be back to the Supreme Court soon when somebody leaves Georgia to come to Illinois to have an abortion and then goes back to Georgia. I cannot imagine that the Supreme Court will say that it is legal to criminalize a trip across state lines to do something that's legal in that other state. But I don't know. This Supreme Court, I'm not a fan of this Supreme Court, and I wouldn't be surprised by anything that they do. The other interesting change that has happened with regard to abortion is following the lead of Texas, the states are not criminalizing abortion at the state level. What they're really doing is creating a bounty system in which they do not have to investigate whether somebody got an illegal abortion in their state. They're allowing anybody who detects that somebody has had an abortion, a private citizen who knows that his neighbor, for example, had an abortion, to go to the police and say she committed a crime. I find that to be one of the most scary propositions that I have learned of in my adult life, to have private citizens start reporting crimes that their neighbors are doing. That sounds like Nazi Germany to me. Okay, one last thing, I think. considering the liberal viewpoint of the death
Yes,
penalty.
Professor, sorry, then the question still remains, at the constitution level, why was this decision made?
Because they think that, as Justice Alito said, the attempt in 1973 to argue from the right of privacy that had just been developed earlier in the 20th century, to allowing a woman to have privacy about her treatment of a fetus, was not in the Constitution. That's Justice Alito said the word abortion does not occur in the Constitution. Of course, it doesn't occur in the Constitution. That's one of the stupidest statements I've ever heard an otherwise intelligent person make. The Constitution doesn't mention the internet or radio or television either. It doesn't mention cameras. They didn't exist then either. But what has that got to do with the decision about whether to make abortion legal or illegal? The implication that if it's not mentioned in the Constitution, we're not going to recognize it as a right that somebody has is simply preposterous. But this is one of the costs, by the way, of the doctrine of so-called originalism, which says that in interpreting the Constitution, we have to go back to what the men, they were all men, the men who wrote the Constitution wrote in the Constitution. The word woman does not occur. The word slavery does not occur in the Constitution. And yet we found things in the Constitution that allowed us, beginning in 1920, we had to amend the Constitution to allow women to vote. We had to have another amendment, the 13th Amendment, to outlaw slavery. This view that the original people who wrote the Constitution control what we do today, I find to be a preposterous notion. I'm not saying we should ignore what they did, of course not. There's a lot of wonderful things in the Constitution, but it shouldn't prevent us from doing things today that would make society a better place. Okay, I'm sorry I started to do this question. I'll try to get through this quickly. Considering the liberal viewpoint of the death penalty and how it doesn't reduce crimes, how does Saudi Arabia, a conservative country with its archaic laws on awarding the death penalty more easily, promises more safety for women than a country like India? That's a good question. And to my knowledge, nobody has done any empirical work in Saudi Arabia to suggest that the society is better, people are happier, or that things are working better on the basis of their widespread use of the death penalty. Okay, another thing here. Looking at your presentation on correlation between crime and abortion, this is what looms in my mind. Is economic analysis of law all about quid pro quo / utility from society, or is there much more? How does transplanting laws from one jurisdiction to another as an ex ante measure work? Will it work the same way? Well, Renita, we better send out for food because it's going to take me an hour to answer this question. There's so much in that excellent remark. Remember earlier I said that efficiency and justice are sometimes two very different things. And I think that I'm speaking now not as an economist or as somebody who taught in a law school, but as a private citizen. I have a lot of justice concerns about the death penalty that I would not try to argue on the basis of efficiency that the death penalty is a valuable thing. I think the moral questions with regard to the death penalty are uppermost. We have to consider those. I was simply addressing the attempts to talk about the deterrence effect of the death penalty. And I think there's general agreement, by the way, today among the careful empiricists who have studied the deterrent effect of the death penalty, that it does not deter significantly. As to your question about transplanting laws from one jurisdiction to another, that's a subject that international law or comparative law has studied for a century, more than a century, whether transplants, as they call them, work, or whether some of our laws are so deeply embedded in the culture and other unspoken customs within a jurisdiction that they might not work. One last question, whether it would be correct to state that there's a trade-off between efficiency and justice. That's possible. It's possible. It's possible that they work together in some circumstances. I think efficiency concerns are always valid, but I don't think that they should, I hate to use this word, trump the justice argument. That is, I don't think that if somebody says it would be efficient to do this, it might be unjust, but it's efficient to do. I don't think that's an argument that I would follow. I'd find much more much more persuasive an argument that says this may be inefficient, but it's just. That I find that's easier for me to follow. But as a general proposition, that there's a trade-off between efficiency and justice. That is, you can sacrifice justice and have more efficiency, or increase justice but lower efficiency. I'm not sure that's true, because I think there are circumstances, I can't give you an example yet, in which efficiency and justice work in the same direction. Possibly the death penalty is one of those examples where we found that it's not efficient. It does not deter capital crimes to impose capital punishment. So the just answer, if it is just, not to execute some people, also turns out to be the result we get from careful empirical work designed to see if it is a deterrent. Great questions, and I value them very much, and I'm sorry for going on too long. Dean Nagar, please forgive me. You must find an audience that's not as good as this one if we're to keep to our schedule.